In Cedar Valley, California, a 75-year-old widow was about to shatter her family's world. What started as a graduation celebration took a shocking turn when they dismissed her skydiving announcement with patronizing laughter. Isabelle Smith wasn't your typical retired librarian. For decades, she had lived as an adventure photographer, known for her fearless spirit and extraordinary eye. When she encountered her family's condescending reactions, she had no idea she was walking into a battle for respect. Isabelle's quiet resolve would lead to a viral sensation that inspired millions. What began as mockery would become a movement. Her family would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the Smith family home, casting warm patterns across the dining room table where Tyler's diploma replica sat propped against a vase of white roses. The celebration had been building momentum for hours. Laughter echoing from the kitchen, the clink of glasses, the steady hum of 3 generations gathering to mark another milestone in their carefully ordered lives. Isabelle Smith sat in her usual chair at the far end of the table, watching her family with quiet eyes that held depths none of them bothered to notice anymore. At 75, she had become invisible in the way that elderly women often do, present but not quite seen, spoken about but not truly heard. Her silver hair was swept back in a neat bun, her floral dress pressed and proper, every inch the gentle grandmother they expected her to be. "Gran, you've been so quiet," Tyler said, settling into the chair beside her with a plate of cake. Fresh out of college with his business degree, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the world was waiting for him to claim it. "What do you think about your grandson becoming a real adult?" Isabel's smile was soft but genuine. "I think you've been a real person all along, dear. The diploma just makes it official to everyone else." The distinction was subtle, but it caught Tyler off guard. He studied his grandmother's face for a moment, as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. Around the table, the conversation continued its familiar rhythm. David discussing investment strategies with his father-in-law, Sarah posting photos to Instagram with captions about family milestones, Lisa recounting a particularly challenging shift at the hospital. "Should we do toasts?" Sarah called out, already positioning her phone to capture the moment. "This needs to be documented properly." David raised his wine glass, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to being heard. To Tyler, who's proven that hard work and smart choices lead to success, "We're proud of the man you've become and excited to see you build a secure future." The words were warm, well-intentioned, but Isabelle noticed what they revealed about her son's worldview: security, safety, the known path. She thought of the young man David had been, full of dreams about traveling the world before settling into the family business. When had those dreams been filed away under impractical? "To my brilliant nephew," Lisa added, "who's going to change the world, safely and responsibly." More glasses raised. More emphasis on safety, on following the prescribed route to happiness. Isabelle felt something stir in her chest, a familiar restlessness that had been growing stronger since Robert's death 2 years ago. The feeling of time slipping away while everyone around her talked about the future, as if it were infinitely available. Tyler stood, his own glass raised. "Thank you all for believing in me, for supporting me through everything. I know I'm lucky to have a family that cares so much about making sure I make the right choices." The right choices. Isabelle's fingers traced the stem of her water glass. She thought about all the right choices she'd made over the decades. Practical, sensible decisions that had slowly buried the woman she'd once been beneath layers of responsibility and expectation. She stood slowly, her movement drawing curious glances around the table. At her age, standing during toasts wasn't expected. She was supposed to remain seated, smiling benevolently while the younger generations spoke about their futures. "I'd like to say something," Isabelle said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that made the conversation falter. "Of course, Mom," David said, though his tone held the patronizing warmth typically reserved for elderly relatives who wanted to share rambling stories about the old days. Isabelle straightened her shoulders, feeling her heartbeat quicken. "Tyler, watching you graduate has reminded me that life offers us many opportunities to begin again. Which is why I've decided to celebrate my 76th birthday next month by going skydiving. The silence that followed was so complete that the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to echo like gunshots. Sarah's phone, still recording, captured the moment of stunned disbelief on every face around the table. Then David laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Mom, that's a good one. You almost had us there." "I'm not joking," Isabelle said simply. The laughter spread around the table like a contagion, but it held an uncomfortable edge. Lisa shook her head with the indulgent expression she might use with a confused patient. "Mom, you can't be serious. At your age, the risk factors alone." According to the CDC, Lisa continued, settling into her professional tone, individuals over 70 have significantly higher rates of injury from extreme sports. Bone density issues, slower reflexes, cardiovascular stress. What would the insurance implications be? David interrupted, his financial advisor instincts kicking in. "Have you considered the liability issues? What if something goes wrong? The family could be held responsible for." David, Isabelle's voice cut through his concerns with surprising firmness. "I'm talking about fulfilling a dream, not filing a lawsuit." Sarah lowered her phone, her social media manager brain clearly calculating the potential embarrassment factor. "Isabelle, honey, maybe we should think about how this might look. I mean, what would people say?" The words hung in the air, revealing more about the family dynamics than anyone realized. What would people say? As if Isabelle's choices were subject to community approval. As if her life existed primarily as a reflection of her family's reputation. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his chair, caught between admiration for his grandmother's unexpected boldness and concern about family expectations. "Gran, where is this coming from? You've never mentioned wanting to skydive before." "There are many things I've never mentioned," Isabelle replied, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that made him look away first. David's voice took on the patient tone he used with difficult clients. "Mom, I understand you might be feeling restless since Dad passed. It's natural to want to feel relevant, to make a statement. But there are safer ways to relevant." The word tasted bitter in Isabelle's mouth. "Is that what you think this is about? Trying to prove I'm still relevant?" The hurt in her voice made David backtrack slightly. "I didn't mean it like that. I just meant that maybe we should explore other activities. What about a nice cruise? Or that pottery class you mentioned years ago?" Years ago. He remembered that offhand comment from years ago but couldn't fathom that she might have dreams beyond pottery and cruises. The realization settled over Isabelle like a cold rain, washing away the last of her hesitation about pursuing her plans. "I appreciate your concern," she said, gathering her composure around her like armor. "But this isn't a cry for relevance. It's something I need to do for myself." Lisa leaned forward, her medical training evident in her assessment. "Mom, be honest with us. Are you feeling depressed? Because there are much better ways to address that than putting yourself in unnecessary danger." Unnecessary danger, the phrase echoed in Isabelle's mind as she looked around the table at her family. These people she'd devoted her life to raising, nurturing, protecting. None of them saw her as someone capable of assessing risk and making her own choices. They saw a fragile old woman who needed to be managed, protected from her own impulses. "I think I'll clear the dishes," Isabelle said quietly, beginning to gather plates with the practiced efficiency of someone who had hosted countless family gatherings. "Mom, we're not finished discussing this," David called after her. "Yes, we are," she replied without turning around. In the kitchen, Isabelle could hear the urgent whispers beginning immediately. Through the thin wall that separated the dining room from the kitchen, their words carried with painful clarity. "She's not thinking straight." Lisa's voice, clinical and concerned. "This could be early signs of cognitive decline. Impulsive behavior, unrealistic planning." "Maybe we should talk to her doctor," Sarah suggested. "Get a professional opinion about her mental state." "I'm worried about liability," David added. "If she gets hurt, if something happens, we could all be held responsible. And the embarrassment factor." Tyler's voice, younger and uncertain. "Maybe she's just, I don't know, trying to feel alive again?" Since Grandpa died, she's been so quiet. That's exactly why this is concerning, Lisa replied. Grief can manifest in dangerous ways. She needs support, not enablement. Isabelle stood at the sink, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as their words washed over her. Cognitive decline, professional opinion, mental state. They were discussing her as if she were a problem to be solved, rather than a person with her own agency and desires. The water she'd turned on to rinse the dishes ran cold over her hands, but she barely noticed. She thought about the years she'd spent being the foundation of this family, the one who remembered birthdays, organized gatherings, provided stability while everyone else pursued their dreams. She'd been the constant, reliable presence that allowed them to take risks, to grow, to become themselves. But somewhere along the way, they'd forgotten that she was more than just their foundation. They'd forgotten that she had once been a person with her own dreams, her own courage, her own capacity for growth. The whispered conference in the dining room continued, their voices mixing with concern and condescension in equal measure. Plans were being made about her future, decisions discussed about her care and well-being, all without her input. They spoke about her as if she were already gone, as if the woman who had raised them, loved them, and sacrificed for them was no longer capable of making choices for herself. Isabelle turned off the water and dried her hands with deliberate care. In the dining room, she could hear Tyler asking if they should call a doctor, David suggesting they might need to have a serious conversation about her living situation, Sarah wondering if this was something that needed to be managed quickly before it got out of hand. She walked to the window above the sink and looked out at the backyard where she'd watched her children play, where she'd hung countless loads of laundry, where she'd stood so many times over the years feeling the weight of responsibility and the gradual erosion of her own identity. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the grass. For the first time in years, Isabelle Smith felt completely alone in her own family home. But in that loneliness, something crystallized, a resolve that had been building since Robert's death. A determination that her family's dismissive concern had just ignited into something stronger than their disapproval. They thought she was having a breakdown, making an impulsive decision based on grief and a desperate need for attention. They had no idea that she was making the first truly authentic choice she'd made in decades. They couldn't imagine that their gentle, aging mother might actually be reclaiming something precious that she'd lost long ago. In the dining room, the discussion continued, but Isabelle was no longer listening. She was thinking about research she needed to do, phone calls she needed to make, and dreams that had been deferred long enough. The whispered concerns of her family faded into background noise as Isabelle began to plan her leap into the sky and back into herself. The house felt different in the silence that followed her family's departure. Isabelle moved through the rooms methodically, collecting abandoned wine glasses and crumpled napkins, the detritus of celebration mixed with disappointment. Each piece of cleanup felt heavier than it should, weighted with the memory of their dismissive laughter still echoing in her ears. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times as she finished loading the dishwasher. Robert had wound that clock every Sunday for 43 years of marriage. She'd kept up the ritual after his death. But tonight the familiar sound felt like a countdown, not just marking hours, but measuring the time she had left to reclaim herself. Her knees protested as she climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, but instead of turning toward her bedroom, she continued up the creaking steps to the attic. She hadn't been up here in months, not since the week after Robert's funeral, when grief had driven her to seek some connection to happier times. The pole chain light flickered to life, illuminating boxes stacked along the slanted walls like forgotten dreams. The air smelled of dust and old wood, tinged with the faint scent of the lavender sachets she'd placed among her stored belongings years ago. Most families used their attics for Christmas decorations and outgrown clothes. Isabelle's attic held the archaeology of a life interrupted. She moved toward the far corner where several boxes bore her maiden name in Robert's careful handwriting, Isabelle Morrison Photography. Her heart tightened at the sight. He'd been the one to pack these away when Lisa was born, when the spare bedroom became a nursery, and her darkroom became storage space for baby clothes and toys. Just temporary, he'd promised, sealing the boxes with brown tape. Once things settle down, once we get the house organized, you can set up again somewhere else. 47 years later, the tape had yellowed and cracked, but the boxes remained unopened. Isabelle chose the smallest box first, her fingers trembling slightly as she peeled away the brittle tape. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, was her first camera, a Nikon F that Robert had given her for her 22nd birthday. The weight of it in her hands transported her instantly to a mountain trail in Colorado, altitude making her dizzy as she scrambled up rocky slopes for the perfect shot of dawn breaking over the Continental Divide. She'd been fearless then. Absolutely fearless. The memory hit her with startling clarity. Herself at 25, camera strap cutting into her shoulder as she hung suspended from a rope, photographing a family of peregrine falcons nesting on a cliff face. She could still feel the rush of wind, the way her heart pounded not with fear, but with pure exhilaration. That photograph had won a regional competition and caught the attention of an editor at Outdoor Life magazine. "You've got an eye for danger," the editor had told her over coffee in Denver, "and the guts to get close enough to capture it." Isabelle set the camera aside and reached for a leather portfolio she remembered buying in Santa Fe during assignment documenting Native American artisans. The portfolio fell open to reveal mounted prints from her early career, images that had taken her to slot canyons in Utah, storm-lashed coastlines in Maine, remote villages in Alaska where she'd spent weeks documenting traditional fishing methods. Each photograph was a memory of the woman she'd been, confident, adventurous, willing to go anywhere for the right shot. She studied a self-portrait, taken in her tent during a solo camping trip, to photograph the northern lights. Even in black and white, her younger self radiated an energy that seemed almost foreign now. When had that light gone out of her eyes? The answer came with the next photograph. A candid shot Robert had taken of her at a gallery opening in San Francisco. 8 months pregnant with David, her camera bag slung awkwardly around her expanding middle. She remembered that evening, how she'd tried to navigate the crowded gallery, how her back had ached, how she'd had to leave early when her ankles swelled. It had been her last professional assignment before David was born. Just for a few years, she'd told herself then. Just until the children are old enough. But a few years had become a decade, and a decade had somehow stretched into a lifetime. There had always been another reason to postpone her return to professional photography. Robert's promotion that required more entertaining, Lisa's learning difficulties that needed attention, David's college applications, then grandchildren to help babysit. Her dreams had been filed away like these boxes, stored with the promise that someday there would be time. Isabelle reached deeper into the box and found what she'd unconsciously been seeking, a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, all in Robert's handwriting. Her fingers knew which one she needed before her eyes found the date. March 15, 1979, written during a business trip when the children were young and money was tight. "My dearest Belle," she read, using the childhood name that only he had ever called her. "I know you've been feeling trapped lately, like the walls of our little house are closing in on your dreams. I see it in your eyes when you watch the evening news and they show footage from places you used to visit with your camera. I know you miss that life, miss the woman you were before you became just a wife and mother." The letter continued, Robert's words bridging the decades between then and now. "You are not just anything, Belle. You are the strongest, most capable person I know. And I promise you, as soon as the kids are older, as soon as we have enough saved, we're going to travel together. You're going to show me all those places you captured through your lens. We'll see the northern lights in Alaska, the slot canyons in Utah, maybe even take that assignment to document the wildlife in Costa Rica that you had to turn down when David was born. I know it feels like someday will never come, but it will. We'll have our adventure, Belle. I promise you that." Isabelle's vision blurred as she read the rest of the letter, his promises for their future adventures, his acknowledgement of her sacrifices, his vision of them growing old together while chasing sunsets around the world. She remembered receiving this letter, how it had sustained her through years of carpools and parent-teacher conferences and family obligations that slowly buried her adventurous spirit beneath layers of responsibility. Someday had never come. Robert's heart attack 2 years ago had ended all possibilities of shared adventures, leaving her with nothing but faded promises and photographs of a woman she barely remembered being. She carefully retied the ribbon around the letters and reached for her laptop, a concession to modern technology that had surprised her children when she'd bought it after Robert's death. "I need to stay connected," she'd explained, though they'd assumed she meant connected to them. She'd actually meant connected to the world beyond their expectations of what a 75-year-old widow should want. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with surprising confidence as she searched for local skydiving companies. The first few websites were clearly aimed at 20-something thrill seekers, all extreme sports rhetoric and images of muscled instructors. But the fourth result caught her attention: Sky High Adventures, with a tagline that read, "Age is just a number. Dreams have no expiration date." The homepage featured a photo that made her heart skip: a silver-haired woman, probably in her 80s, beaming as she landed after what was clearly her first tandem jump. The testimonials section included stories from people well into their 70s and 80s who had discovered the joy of flight later in life. Margaret Thompson, age 84. "I waited my whole life to fly, thinking I was too old, too fragile, too late. Turns out the only thing I was too late for was worrying about what other people thought." Frank Rodriguez, age 77. "My doctor said I had maybe 5 good years left. I decided to make them count. Best decision I ever made." Isabelle clicked through to the instructor profiles and found herself drawn to one face in particular. Jake Morrison, age 45, with kind eyes and a biography that mentioned his specialization in first-time jumpers and older clients. His photo showed him smiling beside an elderly man who clutched a certificate and grinned like he'd just discovered the secret to eternal youth. The frequently asked questions section addressed her family's concerns with matter-of-fact professionalism. Yes, there were age considerations, but no arbitrary age limits. Yes, medical clearance was required for anyone over 60, but most healthy seniors were excellent candidates for tandem jumps. Yes, safety was the primary concern, which is why their safety record was impeccable, and their instructors were among the most experienced in the state. Isabelle found herself reading testimonials from other elderly first-time jumpers. People who had waited decades to pursue dreams their families had dismissed as foolish or dangerous. Their stories resonated with something deep inside her chest, that same restlessness that had been growing stronger since Robert's death, the feeling that she was running out of time to remember who she used to be. She clicked on the contact information and found herself composing an email before she could second-guess the decision. "Dear Jake Morrison, my name is Isabelle Smith and I am 75 years old. I would like to schedule a tandem skydive for my 76th birthday next month. I have been wanting to do this for more years than I care to admit, and I have decided that it's time to stop waiting for the perfect moment. My family thinks I've lost my mind, but I think I've finally found it again. Please let me know what steps I need to take to make this happen. Sincerely, Isabelle Smith." She hit send before she could reconsider, feeling a flutter of excitement mixed with terror. The same feeling she used to get before embarking on a challenging photo assignment, when she'd pack her equipment and head into unknown territory with nothing but her camera and her nerve. The laptop chimed almost immediately, with an automated response promising that someone would contact her within 24 hours. Isabelle closed the computer and looked around the attic, really seeing it for the first time in years. These boxes didn't contain the artifacts of a life abandoned. They contained evidence of a woman who had once been brave enough to chase her dreams across continents. She opened another box and found her old travel journals, filled with her own handwriting documenting adventures that seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman her family saw when they looked at her now. Page after page of detailed accounts of climbing mountains, camping alone in remote wilderness areas, navigating foreign countries with nothing but a camera and an insatiable curiosity about the world. Day 3 in the Brooks Range, she read from a journal entry dated 1974. Temperature dropped to 15 below last night, but I got the shot I came for. A family of Arctic foxes playing in the snow, worth every frozen finger and sleepless night. This is what it feels like to be fully alive. Fully alive. When was the last time she had felt fully alive? Isabelle carefully packed the journal back into its box, but she kept the old Nikon camera out, cradling it in her hands like a talisman. The weight of it felt familiar, comforting. She thought about the woman who had owned this camera, who had carried it up mountains and into remote corners of the world. That woman had been fearless, confident, willing to take risks for the sake of capturing something beautiful or meaningful. That woman was still inside her somewhere, buried under decades of being, quote, responsible and practical and appropriate. Her family's reaction tonight had hurt, but it had also awakened something that had been sleeping for too long. Their dismissive laughter had been the catalyst she needed to stop waiting for permission to be herself again. She made her way back downstairs, the Nikon still in her hands, and settled into Robert's old chair in the living room. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator. For the first time since his death, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt full of possibility. Tomorrow she would receive a call from Jake Morrison. Tomorrow she would take the first concrete step toward reclaiming the adventurous spirit her family had forgotten she possessed. Tomorrow she would begin the process of proving to herself, and to them, that being 75 didn't mean being finished. Tonight she sat with her camera and her memories, feeling more like herself than she had in years. The woman who had once hung from cliff faces and chased storms across the prairie was still there, waiting patiently for her chance to soar again. The call came at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning, just as Isabelle was finishing her second cup of coffee and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd spent most of the night alternating between excitement and doubt, Robert's old Nikon sitting on the kitchen table like a silent witness to her late-night crisis of confidence. "Mrs. Smith? This is Jake Morrison from Sky High Adventures. I got your email." His voice was warm, professional, but without the careful tone people usually adopted when speaking to elderly clients. No extra loud volume, no simplified language, just normal conversation between two adults. "Thank you for calling so quickly," Isabelle said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I wasn't sure if you'd take my request seriously." "Why wouldn't I?" Jake asked, and she could hear genuine curiosity rather than polite dismissal. "Your email was clear about what you want to do. Age doesn't disqualify someone from pursuing their dreams, as long as they're physically and mentally prepared for the experience." The words hit her like a revelation. When was the last time someone had spoken to her as if her desires were valid simply because she'd expressed them? "My family thinks I've lost my mind," she admitted. Jake chuckled, a sound that held understanding rather than mockery. "In my experience, that usually means you've found it again. Would you like to come in and discuss the details in person? I find these conversations work better face to face." 2 hours later, Isabelle sat in her Honda Civic in the parking lot of Sky High Adventures, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the low-slung building that looked more like an airplane hangar than the gateway to her dreams. Through the large windows, she could see people moving around inside, some in jumpsuits, others in street clothes, all of them looking far younger than her 75 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For a moment, the voices of her family echoed in her mind. What would people say? Have you considered the liability issues? This could be early signs of cognitive decline. Then she thought about the journal entry she'd read the night before, about feeling fully alive at 15 below zero in the Alaskan wilderness, and she turned off the engine. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and immediately she was greeted by the organized chaos of an active drop zone. Parachutes hung from the ceiling like colorful clouds, instructors moved between students with practiced efficiency, and the walls were covered with photographs of jumpers in various stages of free fall, all of them wearing expressions of pure joy. "Mrs. Smith?" She turned to find a man approaching with an easy stride and a genuine smile. Jake Morrison looked exactly like his photograph, but in person she could see the intelligence in his eyes and the calm competence that came from years of keeping people safe in dangerous situations. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, extending her hand. His handshake was firm but respectful, and when he gestured toward a small office area, he walked beside her rather than ahead. Small details that suggested he saw her as an equal rather than someone who needed to be managed. "Coffee," he offered as they settled into chairs across from a desk covered with certifications, safety records, and more photographs of happy jumpers. "Please." She accepted the cup gratefully, using the moment to study the office more carefully. This wasn't some fly-by-night operation targeting adrenaline junkies. The walls displayed credentials from multiple skydiving organizations, safety awards, and what appeared to be a spotless inspection record from the Federal Aviation Administration. "So," Jake said, settling back in his chair with his own coffee, "tell me about this dream of yours." The invitation was so simple, so free of judgment, that Isabelle found herself talking more openly than she had in years. She told him about her photography career, about the adventures she'd postponed, about the promises that had never been fulfilled. She found herself describing the restlessness she'd felt since Robert's death, the growing certainty that if she didn't act now, she never would. Jake listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally but mostly just giving her the space to articulate feelings she'd barely admitted to herself. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "My grandmother wanted to go skydiving," he said finally. "She mentioned it once when she was about your age. Said she'd always wondered what it would feel like to fly like a bird. My family laughed it off as one of Grandma Rose's crazy ideas. She was this tiny Irish woman who made the best apple pie in 3 counties, and nobody could imagine her doing anything more dangerous than crossing the street." He paused, staring at something beyond Isabelle's shoulder. "She died 2 years later, peaceful, in her sleep, surrounded by family. At the funeral, my uncle mentioned her skydiving comment, and everyone chuckled about dear old Rose and her wild imagination. But I kept thinking about how she'd looked when she mentioned it, like she was seeing something beautiful that the rest of us couldn't imagine." Isabelle felt her throat tighten. "Do you regret not taking her seriously?" "Every day," Jake said simply, "which is why I started specializing in older first-time jumpers about 5 years ago. I've taken people up who were in their 80s, people who waited their whole lives to feel what it's like to fly. And every single one of them, every single one, told me afterward that they wished they'd done it sooner." He leaned forward, his voice taking on the passion of someone who'd found his calling. "Mrs. Smith, I've been jumping for 23 years and instructing for 15. I've done over 4,000 tandem jumps, and I can tell you that chronological age has very little to do with someone's ability to enjoy and benefit from skydiving. What matters is physical health, mental preparation, and the willingness to trust the process." Isabelle set down her coffee cup, feeling something relax in her chest. "My family thinks I'm being reckless. Impulsive. Are you being impulsive?" Jake asked. "Or are you finally acting on something you've wanted for a long time?" The question hung between them, and Isabelle realized that Jake Morrison was the first person who'd asked her what she wanted, rather than telling her what she should want. "The latter," she said firmly. "Definitely the latter." Jake smiled and reached for a folder on his desk. "Then let's talk about making it happen. First, the medical requirements. Anyone over 60 needs clearance from their physician. Not because we think older people can't handle skydiving, but because we want to make sure there are no underlying conditions that could be exacerbated by the experience. Do you have any heart problems, blood pressure issues, recent surgeries?" "I'm healthier than most people half my age," Isabelle said, thinking of her daily walks, her volunteer work at the library that kept her on her feet for hours, her clean bill of health from her last physical. "My doctor always jokes that I'm going to outlive everyone else in the waiting room." "Excellent. I'll give you the forms for medical clearance. It's straightforward, just needs your doctor's signature. Next, let's talk about the training process." Jake opened the folder and pulled out several brochures and information sheets. "For tandem jumps, which is what I recommend for first-timers, the training is relatively simple but thorough. We'll spend about 30 minutes going over the equipment, body positioning, emergency procedures, and what to expect during the jump itself. The actual experience lasts about 25 minutes from takeoff to landing, with 40 to 60 seconds in freefall." Isabelle studied the materials he handed her, impressed by their professionalism. These weren't adrenaline-fueled marketing materials, but serious educational documents that treated skydiving as both an adventure and a discipline requiring proper preparation. "What about the actual jump?" she asked. "I have to admit, when I imagine it, I mostly picture falling out of a plane and screaming." Jake laughed, a genuine sound that put her at ease. That's a completely normal fear, and it's not at all what the experience is actually like. Would you like to see some videos? He turned his laptop toward her and pulled up a series of short films showing tandem jumps from start to finish. Isabelle watched, mesmerized, as people her age and older experienced what looked like pure joy as they fell through the sky. Their faces showed not terror but wonder, not panic but peace. The most common thing people say after their first jump, Jake explained as they watched, is that it doesn't feel like falling. It feels like flying. The airplane is moving forward when you exit, so you're not dropping straight down. You're moving through the air. And after the first few seconds, when you reach terminal velocity, it stops feeling like you're falling at all. It feels like you're floating on a cushion of air. One video showed a woman who looked to be in her late 70s, her silver hair streaming behind her as she spread her arms like wings. Her expression was one of absolute transcendence, as if she'd discovered something she'd been searching for her entire life. That's Margaret Thompson, Jake said, noting her attention. She was 84 when she made her first jump. She'd been a secretary for 40 years, never did anything her family would call adventurous, but she said she'd been dreaming about flying since she was a little girl. How did she feel afterward? Isabelle asked, unable to look away from Margaret's radiant face. See for yourself, Jake said, clicking to another video. This one showed Margaret on the ground after her landing, still strapped to her instructor but standing on solid earth. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was laughing with pure joy. I can't believe I waited so long, Margaret was saying to the camera. I spent 84 years thinking I was too old, too scared, too sensible to do something like this. But I've never felt more like myself than I did up there. It was like remembering who I was meant to be. Isabelle felt her own eyes fill with tears. Margaret's words captured exactly what she'd been struggling to articulate about her own desires, her own sense of having lost touch with her authentic self somewhere along the way. What happened to Margaret afterward? She asked. She became one of our regulars, Jake said with obvious affection. She's made 12 jumps now, and she's become something of a local celebrity in the senior living community where she moved last year. She gives talks about it, encourages other people to pursue their dreams. She says skydiving didn't just give her an adventure, it gave her back her sense of possibility. Jake closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Smith, I want to be completely honest with you. Skydiving does involve risk. Any adventure sport does. But with proper equipment, training, and experienced instructors, it's statistically safer than driving to the grocery store. The bigger risk, in my opinion, is spending the rest of your life wondering what it would have felt like. Isabelle thought about Robert's letter, about all the adventures they'd postponed until someday. She thought about the photography equipment gathering dust in her attic, about the woman she'd been, who wasn't afraid to hang from cliff faces for the perfect shot. What do I need to do to make this happen? She asked. Jake's smile was brilliant. First, get your medical clearance. I'll give you the forms and a letter explaining exactly what your doctor needs to know. Second, schedule your ground school and jump. I recommend doing the training on one day and the actual jump on another. It gives you time to process the information and ask any questions that come up. He pulled out a calendar and pen. When did you want to do this? My birthday is in 3 weeks, Isabelle said. The 15th. Perfect. How about we schedule your ground school for the 12th? That's a Friday. And your jump for the 15th itself. Birthday jumps are special. We'll make sure you have the full experience. Isabelle looked at the dates he'd written down, her heart racing with excitement and terror in equal measure. This was really happening. She was really going to do this. There's one more thing, Jake said, reaching into his desk drawer. I always give this to my older first-time jumpers. He handed her a small card with a quote printed in elegant script. It is never too late to be what you might have been. George Eliot. I want you to take these materials home, he continued, handing her a packet of information. Read through everything, show it to your family if you want. The safety statistics, the training procedures, the medical requirements, it's all there. And if you have any questions, any concerns, call me directly. Isabelle accepted the packet, feeling its weight like a promise in her hands. Jake, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you really think I can do this? I mean, honestly, I'm 75 years old. I haven't done anything remotely adventurous in decades, And my family thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. Do you think I'm being foolish? Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years helping people overcome their fears. Mrs. Smith, in the 15 minutes we've been talking, you've told me about climbing mountains for photographs, camping alone in Alaska, and navigating foreign countries with nothing but a camera and your courage. You've described a lifetime of adventures that most people only dream about. The only thing that's changed is that other people have convinced you that age means the end of possibility. He leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. I don't think you're being foolish at all. I think you're being brave. And I think that woman who used to hang from cliff faces is still in there, just waiting for permission to come out again. As Isabelle drove home, Jake's words echoed in her mind, along with Margaret Thompson's joyful tears and the feeling of being taken seriously by someone who understood the difference between recklessness and courage. The packet of materials sat on her passenger seat like a roadmap to reclaiming herself. For the first time since making her announcement at Tyler's party, she felt not alone, but supported. Jake Morrison had seen her not as a fragile old woman making a desperate grab for relevance, but as someone worthy of having her dreams taken seriously. The feeling was intoxicating, and Isabelle found herself driving a little faster than usual, eager to get home and begin preparing for the adventure that would prove to herself and to her family that it was never too late to remember how to fly. Isabelle had barely set her purse down when she heard the unmistakable sound of David's key turning in her front door lock. She'd given him that key for emergencies, but the way he used it, walking into her home without knocking, without waiting for permission, had become a symbol of everything wrong with how her family treated her autonomy. Mom? David's voice carried the forced calm of someone preparing for an unpleasant but necessary conversation. We need to talk. Through the living room window, Isabelle could see Lisa's car parked behind David's BMW in her driveway. They'd coordinated this ambush, planned it like a military operation. The realization stung, but it also steeled her resolve in a way their dismissive laughter hadn't quite managed. I'm in the kitchen, she called back, quickly sliding Jake's information packet into the drawer where she kept her recipe cards. She'd learned long ago that sometimes strategic concealment was necessary for self-preservation. David appeared in the doorway first, his tie loosened and his expression wearing the patient mask he used with difficult clients. Lisa followed close behind, still in her scrubs from the hospital, her medical bag slung over her shoulder like she was making a house call to evaluate an unstable patient. Where were you this morning? David asked without preamble. We came by around 10, but you weren't here. The presumption in his tone, that he had the right to know her whereabouts, that her absence required explanation, made Isabelle's jaw tighten. I had an appointment. What kind of appointment? Lisa stepped forward, her nurse's training evident, in the way she was subtly assessing Isabelle's appearance, looking for signs of distress or cognitive decline. Isabelle poured herself a glass of water, taking her time, letting them wait. A personal appointment. Mom. David's voice took on the gentle but firm tone he probably used when explaining investment risks to elderly clients. We're worried about you. Yesterday's announcement. It's not like you to make impulsive decisions. What makes you think it was impulsive? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Lisa stepped in smoothly, pulling a folder from her medical bag. I've brought some information I think you should see. Statistics about injury rates in extreme sports for people over 70, case studies from emergency rooms about skydiving accidents. She spread several printed articles across Isabelle's kitchen table like evidence in a trial. The headlines were deliberately alarming. Senior citizen dies in skydiving accident. Emergency room surge in elderly extreme sports injuries. When adventure tourism becomes elder abuse. Isabelle glanced at the articles without picking them up. Did you specifically search for negative stories? Or did you also look up safety statistics and success rates? Mom, we're trying to protect you, Lisa said, her voice carrying the professional patience she used with confused patients. These activities might seem exciting, but the risks for someone your age. Someone my age, Isabelle repeated slowly. What exactly does that mean, Lisa? Her daughter blinked, clearly not expecting the question to be turned back on her. Well, you're 75. Bone density decreases, reflexes slow, balance becomes more precarious. My bone density is excellent, according to my last scan. My reflexes are fine, which you'd know if you'd seen me catch that vase Tyler knocked over at his party. And my balance is better than most people half my age, thanks to my daily walks and yoga classes. David leaned forward. Mom, this isn't about your physical capabilities. It's about appropriate behavior for someone in your position. My position? The words came out sharper than Isabelle intended. And what position would that be? You're a widow, a grandmother, a respected member of the community, David said, his discomfort with the conversation becoming more obvious. People look up to you as a stable, sensible influence. What would they think if they saw you? Jumping out of an airplane, Isabelle finished. The horror. Lisa pulled out her phone and opened what appeared to be a prepared document. I've researched several alternative activities that might satisfy your need for adventure, but with appropriate safety measures. There's a lovely senior center in Sacramento that offers hot air balloon rides with medical personnel on board. Or we could book you on one of those scenic train rides through the mountains. Safe adventures, Isabelle said. Adventures with training wheels and medical supervision. Adventures that won't result in your death or dismemberment, David said bluntly. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. Isabelle studied her children's faces, the worry that was genuine but patronizing, the love that had somehow become indistinguishable from control. Lisa, she said finally, when you decided to become a nurse, how did I react? Her daughter looked confused by the change of subject. You were supportive, of course. You helped me study you. I was terrified. Isabelle interrupted. Do you remember the night before you started working in the emergency room? I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the ways you could be hurt. Needle sticks, violent patients, infectious diseases, the emotional trauma of watching people die. Lisa's expression softened slightly. Mom, I didn't know. But I didn't try to talk you out of it. I didn't print out articles about hospital employee injury rates or suggest you consider a safer career in pediatrics or dermatology. Do you know why? Neither of her children answered. Because I understood that some things are worth the risk. Because I knew that trying to keep you safe by keeping you small would be the cruelest thing I could do to someone I love. David shifted uncomfortably. That's different, Mom. Lisa's career choice was practical, necessary. And this is impractical and unnecessary? Isabelle reached into her recipe drawer and pulled out Jake's information packet. Before you answer that, maybe you should look at some actual facts instead of cherry-picked horror stories. She spread Jake's materials across the table, covering Lisa's alarming headlines with professional safety records, training protocols, and testimonials from satisfied customers. The contrast was striking. Lisa's articles were sensationalized fear-mongering, while Jake's information was measured, professional, and comprehensive. Sky High Adventures has completed over 15,000 jumps with 0 fatalities and only 3 minor injuries in the past decade, Isabelle read from their safety record. Their instructors average 12 years of experience, and they exceed all FAA safety requirements. Lisa picked up one of the brochures, her expression skeptical. Anyone can print statistics, Mom. That doesn't mean... It means I did research instead of making emotional decisions based on fear, Isabelle said firmly, which is more than I can say for either of you. David's face flushed. We're not being emotional. We're being realistic about the risks involved in me living my life according to my own choices instead of your expectations. The words hung in the air like a challenge. David stood up, his hands pressed flat against the table, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he'd lost patience with a client's poor financial decisions. Mom, I'm going to be blunt with you. This behavior is concerning. Making major decisions without consulting your family, refusing to listen to reason, pursuing dangerous activities that could leave you injured or dead. These are warning signs. Lisa and I have been discussing the possibility that you might need additional support. Additional support, Isabelle repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Professional evaluation, Lisa clarified, her medical training overriding her daughter's instincts. just to make sure there aren't underlying issues affecting your judgment. Depression, early-stage dementia, grief-related psychosis. Psychosis. The word hit Isabelle like a physical blow. You think wanting to go skydiving is a sign of psychosis? We think making impulsive, dangerous decisions without consideration for the people who love you might indicate that you need help processing Dad's death, David said, his voice gentler but no less condescending. Isabelle felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't just about skydiving anymore. This was about her children deciding that their 75-year-old mother was no longer competent to make decisions about her own life. And if I refuse this professional evaluation? David and Lisa exchanged a look that told Isabelle they'd already discussed this possibility. We'd have to consider other options, David said carefully. Such as? Legal guardianship, Lisa said quietly. For your own protection. The kitchen fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt dangerous. Isabelle stared at her children, these adults she'd raised, sacrificed for, shaped into the people they'd become, and realized they were threatening to have her declared incompetent because she wanted to pursue a dream they found inconvenient. You would have me declared mentally unfit, she said slowly, because I want to go skydiving. Because you're exhibiting concerning behavior patterns, Lisa corrected. Impulsive decision-making, disregard for safety, refusal to accept reasonable advice. From people who think reasonable advice includes hot air balloon rides with medical supervision, David's phone buzzed, and Isabelle saw Tyler's name on the screen. David glanced at it, then declined the call. A few seconds later, it buzzed again. Maybe you should answer that, Isabelle suggested. Tyler might have something to contribute to this family discussion about my mental fitness. David reluctantly accepted the call. Tyler, we're in the middle of… What? No, we're at Grandma's house. What do you mean? What are we doing here? Isabelle could hear Tyler's voice through the phone, though she couldn't make out the words. David's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable. We're just having a conversation about… Tyler, this isn't really… Fine. Yes, fine, come over if you want. He hung up and looked at Isabelle with frustrated resignation. Tyler's on his way over. He seems to think we're staging some kind of intervention. Aren't you? Isabelle asked. Before David could answer, they heard Tyler's car in the driveway, followed immediately by the sound of him using his own key to enter the house. Unlike David's presumptuous entrance, Tyler's arrival felt like reinforcements arriving. Seriously? Tyler appeared in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene with obvious disapproval. You're actually doing this? You're actually trying to have Grandma declared incompetent because she wants to go skydiving? Tyler, this is a family matter, David began. I am family, Tyler shot back. And I think what Grandma wants to do is amazing. The kitchen suddenly felt very small. Lisa gathered up her alarming articles while David tried to maintain his authority in the face of his son's unexpected opposition. Isabelle felt a warmth spread through her chest at Tyler's support, even as she braced herself for the confrontation that was clearly about to escalate. Tyler, you don't understand the risks involved, Lisa said, falling back on her medical expertise. At your grandmother's age, at Grandma's age, she's old enough to make her own decisions. Tyler interrupted. And young enough to still have adventures. He moved to stand beside Isabelle, a gesture of solidarity that meant more to her than she could express. For the first time since this ordeal began, she didn't feel alone against her family's determination to keep her safe by keeping her small. This is ridiculous, David said, his composure finally cracking. You're 22 years old, Tyler. You don't get to make decisions about your grandmother's well-being. And you don't get to make decisions about her dreams, Tyler replied. When did we become the kind of family that tries to control each other instead of supporting each other? Isabelle looked around her kitchen, at the safety statistics scattered across her table, at Lisa's medical bag full of evidence for her incompetence, at David's frustrated attempts to maintain control, at Tyler's fierce defense of her autonomy. This wasn't how she'd imagined this conversation going, but it had clarified something important. Her family's love for her was real, but it had become possessive, protective in ways that diminished rather than supported her. They wanted to keep her safe, but their definition of safety required her to abandon any aspect of herself that made them uncomfortable. "I'm going skydiving on my 76th birthday," she said quietly, her voice cutting through their argument. "I'm doing it with a reputable company, proper safety protocols, and medical clearance from my doctor. I'm doing it because it's something I want to do, something that will make me happy, something that honors the adventurous woman I used to be and want to be again." She stood up, gathering Jake's materials from the table. "You can support me, or you can oppose me, but you cannot stop me. And if you try to have me declared incompetent for wanting to live my life on my own terms, you'll discover that the woman who raised you has more fight left in her than you ever imagined." David and Lisa stared at her in shocked silence. Tyler smiled with obvious pride, and Isabelle Smith felt, for the first time in years, like the fearless photographer who used to hang from cliff faces had finally come home. The sound of Tyler's car pulling away from the driveway took with it the last echo of the family confrontation that had left Isabelle's kitchen feeling like a battlefield. David and Lisa had departed in stony silence after Isabelle's declaration of independence, but Tyler had lingered, his eyes scanning the scattered materials on the table with obvious curiosity. 3 days had passed since that tense afternoon, and Isabelle was surprised to find Tyler standing on her doorstep again, this time holding 2 coffee cups from the local cafe and wearing an expression that mixed nervousness with determination. "I brought coffee," he said, holding up the cups like a peace offering. "And I was hoping we could talk about something that doesn't involve Dad trying to have you committed." Isabelle accepted the coffee gratefully, studying her grandson's face. At 22, Tyler carried himself with the careful confidence of someone still figuring out how to be an adult, but there was something different about him today, a purposefulness she hadn't seen since his childhood. "What's on your mind?" she asked, gesturing for him to sit at the kitchen table where Jake's materials still lay spread out like evidence of her rebellion. Tyler picked up one of the brochures, studying the photos of older skydivers with fascination rather than concern. "I keep thinking about what you said the other night, about there being things you've never mentioned. It made me realize I don't really know much about who you were before you were just Grandma." The word "just" hung between them, and Isabelle saw in Tyler's eyes the recognition of how limiting that single role had become. She thought about the boxes in her attic, about the woman whose adventures were documented in fading photographs and dusty journals. "Would you like to see something?" she asked. 20 minutes later, they sat on her living room floor surrounded by photo albums, camera equipment, and travel journals that Tyler examined with the wonder of an archaeologist discovering an ancient civilization. "You took this?" he asked, holding up a black and white print of a thunderstorm over the Grand Canyon, lightning forking down from massive clouds while tiny human figures stood silhouetted on the canyon rim. 1973, Isabelle said, remembering the weight of the camera in her hands, the electricity in the air that had made her hair stand on end. "I waited 4 hours for that storm to develop properly. Your grandfather thought I was crazy for staying out there with all the lightning." Tyler set down the photograph and picked up another, this one showing Isabelle herself, 30 years younger, rappelling down a cliff face in Yosemite with her camera equipment strapped to her back. "This is incredible," he said softly. You were a real adventurer. A professional one." Something in his voice made Isabelle look at him more carefully. "Were? I may be older, Tyler, but I'm not dead yet." He flushed, setting down the photo. "I didn't mean, it's just that I never knew any of this existed. You never talked about these adventures, never mentioned your photography career. Why?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Isabelle thought about the gradual process by which her identity had been subsumed into her roles as wife, mother, grandmother. How the woman who had climbed mountains for the perfect shot had slowly disappeared beneath layers of domestic responsibility and family expectations. "Life happened," she said finally. "Your grandfather and I needed to focus on raising your father and aunt, building a stable home. There wasn't room for both the adventurous photographer and the reliable mother." "But why couldn't you be both?" The innocence of the question, the genuine bewilderment in Tyler's voice, made Isabelle smile sadly. "Because adventurous photographers don't always come home for dinner on time." Because reliable mothers don't disappear into the wilderness for weeks at a time, chasing the perfect shot. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, studying a photograph of Isabelle standing beside a small plain in Alaska, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, and snow-capped mountains stretching endlessly behind her. "I think I understand," he said finally. "About the skydiving, I mean. It's not really about jumping out of a plane, is it? It's about remembering who you used to be." Isabelle felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Your father and aunt see it as reckless behavior. They think I'm having some kind of breakdown. Dad sees everything as a risk assessment," Tyler said with a bitterness that surprised her. "He's been doing the same thing to me since I graduated. Every conversation is about safe career paths, stable investments, reasonable choices. It's like he's forgotten that some things are worth taking risks for." Something in his tone made Isabelle study his face more carefully. "What kind of risks are you thinking about?" Tyler set down the photograph and looked directly at her. "I want to be a documentary filmmaker. I've wanted it since I was in high school, but every time I mention it, Dad talks about market saturation and financial instability. He's already got me lined up for interviews at investment firms, says I need to think practically about my future." "And what do you want to think about?" "Stories," Tyler said immediately. "Real stories about real people doing extraordinary things. Like," he gestured at the photographs scattered around them, "like this. Like what you're doing now. When I heard you announce that you were going skydiving, I didn't think you were crazy. I thought you were brave." Isabelle reached for one of her old journals, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. "Listen to this," she said, and began reading. "Day 5 in the Brooks Range. The temperature hasn't risen above 0 in 3 days. But I've captured something extraordinary. A family of Arctic foxes playing in the snow, completely unaware that their joy is being witnessed. This is what it feels like to be fully alive, to be exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do." Tyler listened intently, and when she finished reading, he was quiet for a long moment. "When's the last time you felt like that?" he asked. "Not since your grandfather died," Isabelle admitted. "Maybe not for years before that. But when I met with Jake Morrison, when I saw those videos of other people my age discovering what it feels like to fly, I felt something wake up inside me that I thought was gone forever." Tyler picked up Jake's brochure again, studying the testimonials from elderly first-time jumpers. "I want to document this," he said suddenly. "Your whole journey, from announcement to landing. Not for some class project or portfolio piece, but because I think other people need to see what it looks like when someone refuses to let other people's fears define their possibilities." Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Martinez-Smith sat in her home office staring at her computer screen, her initial research into Isabelle's embarrassing skydiving phase having taken an unexpected turn. What had started as damage control research, how to spin her mother-in-law's impulsive behavior into something manageable for social media, had become something else entirely. The Google search for Isabelle Morrison photographer had returned results that made Sarah's mouth drop open. Her mother-in-law hadn't just been a hobbyist with a camera, she'd been a legitimate adventure photographer whose work had appeared in National Geographic, Outside Magazine, and Sierra Club publications throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. Sarah scrolled through archived articles, each one revealing another layer of the woman she'd known only as David's proper, conventional mother. Here was a feature story about women breaking barriers in adventure photography that included a full-page photo of young Isabelle hanging from climbing gear while photographing an eagle's nest. Another article profiled her work documenting native fishing practices in remote Alaskan villages. "The most remarkable thing about Isabelle Morrison," one interview quote read, "is her ability to capture the extraordinary in the ordinary, to show us the adventure that exists in every moment if we're brave enough to look for it." Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling guilty about her initial reaction to Isabelle's announcement. She'd been so focused on how it might reflect on the family's image that she'd completely missed the fact that her mother-in-law was reclaiming something precious, an identity that had been set aside but never truly abandoned. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "The Henderson campaign wants to know if you can manage their social media for the product launch. Big money if you're interested." Sarah stared at the text, then looked back at the articles about Isabelle's photography career. She thought about Tyler's excitement when he'd called her earlier, describing his plan to document his grandmother's skydiving journey. She thought about the woman she'd known for 15 years as simply David's mother, and how that woman had turned out to be someone far more complex and interesting than any of them had bothered to discover. She picked up her phone and texted back, "Not available. Working on something more important." Then she opened a new browser tab and began researching how to properly document and promote a story that might actually matter, the story of a woman who refused to let age define her possibilities. The morning of her first ground school session, Isabelle woke before dawn with the kind of anticipation she hadn't felt in decades. It was the same electric energy that used to course through her veins before embarking on a challenging photography assignment. Part excitement, part terror, all possibility. She dressed carefully in comfortable clothes suitable for physical training, then surprised herself by adding the small silver compass necklace Robert had given her on their 10th anniversary. "So you'll always find your way back to me," he'd said. Today, she hoped it would help her find her way back to herself. The drive to Sky High Adventures felt different this time. Instead of nervous uncertainty, Isabelle felt a growing sense of rightness, as if she was moving towards something that had been waiting for her all along. The October morning was crisp and clear, perfect weather for jumping, according to the materials Jake had given her. She arrived to find the drop zone bustling with activity. Instructors moved between students with practiced efficiency, parachutes billowed in the packing area like colorful flowers, and the sound of aircraft engines warming up provided a steady backdrop to the organized chaos of people pursuing their dreams of flight. "Mrs. Smith?" Jake's voice carried across the hangar as he approached with his characteristic easy stride. "Ready to become a skydiver?" "As ready as a 75-year-old can be," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Jake's laugh was warm and genuine. "In my experience, 75-year-olds are often more ready than people half their age. Less to prove, more to appreciate." He led her to a quiet corner of the hangar where training equipment was set up, practice harnesses, model parachutes, and a video screen displaying aerial views of the jump zone. 2 other students were already there, both probably in their 30s, both looking nervous in the way that suggested they were questioning their life choices. "Let me introduce you to your fellow first-timers," Jake said. "Marcus, Jenny, this is Isabelle. She's celebrating her birthday with us next week." Marcus, a software engineer with the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors, looked at Isabelle with obvious surprise. "Wow, that's really inspiring. I've been wanting to do this for years but kept finding excuses." Jenny, a marketing executive whose manicured appearance suggested she wasn't accustomed to activities that might mess up her hair, smiled with genuine warmth. "My daughter dared me to do this. She said I was too uptight to try anything truly adventurous. I guess I'm here to prove her wrong." "I'm here to prove something to myself," Isabelle said simply, and something in her tone made both younger students regard her with new respect. Jake began with the basics. Equipment overview, safety protocols, emergency procedures. Isabelle found herself absorbing the information with the focused intensity she'd once brought to learning new photography techniques. The parachute system was more complex than she'd imagined, with primary and reserve chutes, automatic activation devices, and multiple backup safety systems. "The beautiful thing about tandem jumping," Jake explained as they examined the equipment, "is that you're attached to someone who's done this thousands of times. Your job isn't to be the expert. It's to trust the process and experience the joy. Trust the process." The phrase resonated with Isabelle in ways that went beyond skydiving. She thought about how much of her life had been spent trying to control every variable, to ensure safety and stability for her family. When was the last time she'd simply trusted and let go? The physical training was more demanding than she'd expected, but well within her capabilities. Jake had them practice the exit position, arms crossed over chest, legs bent, chin up, and the stable spread eagle formation they'd maintained during freefall. Isabelle's years of yoga served her well. Her balance was better than both younger students, and her flexibility impressed even Jake. "You've got natural body awareness," he commented, as she demonstrated the proper landing position. "Have you done any physical training recently?" Yoga for 15 years, daily walks, and apparently a lifetime of climbing mountains that I'd forgotten my body remembered, Isabelle replied. As the morning progressed, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling intimidated by the younger students, Isabelle found herself becoming a stabilizing presence. When Marcus panicked during the emergency procedures demonstration, she was the one who talked him through his anxiety, with the calm voice of someone who'd faced real danger before. The key, she told him, is remembering that fear and excitement are physiologically identical. Your body doesn't know the difference. You get to choose which story to tell yourself about what you're feeling. Jenny looked at her with curiosity. You sound like you've done scary things before. Isabelle thought about rappelling down cliff faces with expensive camera equipment, about camping alone in bear country, about navigating foreign countries with nothing but her courage and curiosity. A few, she said with a slight smile. Jake watched these interactions with obvious approval. Later, as they took a break, he pulled Isabelle aside. You're a natural teacher, he said. The way you calmed Marcus down, the confidence you're radiating, it's affecting the whole group dynamic. Have you considered that your skydiving journey might inspire other people your age to pursue their own adventures? Isabelle hadn't considered it, but the idea intrigued her. What do you mean? I get calls from older people all the time. People who want to try skydiving but are terrified their families will think they're crazy. They need to see someone like them doing it successfully. You could be that example. The afternoon session focused on the actual jump sequence: aircraft boarding, altitude progression, the moment of exit, free-fall positioning, canopy deployment, and landing procedures. Jake showed them videos of actual jumps, including several, featuring older first-time skydivers, whose faces showed the same transformation Isabelle hoped to experience herself. The exit is the hardest part for most people, Jake explained as they watched footage of jumpers leaving the aircraft. It goes against every survival instinct we have. But once you're in freefall, once you realize you're not actually falling but flying, everything changes. Isabelle studied the faces of the jumpers in the videos, noting the moment when terror transformed into wonder. She thought about Margaret Thompson, the 84-year-old whose joy had been so infectious, and wondered if she would experience that same sense of transcendence. As the training session concluded, Jake handed each student a certificate acknowledging their completion of ground school. You're officially certified for tandem skydiving, he announced. Next week, weather permitting, you'll put all this knowledge to use. Marcus shook Isabelle's hand with obvious gratitude. Thank you for talking me through my panic attack. I don't think I could have gotten through today without your help. Jenny hugged her impulsively. You're amazing. I hope I have half your courage when I'm your age. You'll have exactly as much courage as you choose to have, Isabelle replied. Age has nothing to do with it. Driving home, Isabelle felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. The physical training had proven she was more capable than her family believed. The mental preparation had awakened skills she'd thought were dormant, and the interaction with other students had reminded her of something she'd forgotten: her natural ability to mentor and inspire. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. Tyler's name appeared on the screen. Grandma, how did it go? I've been thinking about you all day. Better than I expected, she said, gathering her training materials from the passenger seat. Much better. Can I come over? I want to hear everything, and I have something to show you. 20 minutes later, Tyler sat at her kitchen table with his laptop open, his excitement palpable as he showed her what he'd been working on. I've been researching your photography career, he said, pulling up archived magazine articles and exhibition reviews. Grandma, you were famous. I mean, really famous in the adventure photography world. Look at this review from a 1978 gallery show in San Francisco. He read aloud. Isabelle Morrison's work transcends traditional nature photography to capture something essential about the human relationship with wilderness. Her images don't just show us beautiful places. They show us what it means to be brave enough to seek beauty in dangerous places. Isabelle stared at the review, remembering that gallery opening, how proud she'd felt to see her work displayed alongside established photographers whose careers she'd admired. I'd forgotten about that review, she said softly. There's more, Tyler continued, clicking to another article. This piece from Outside Magazine calls you one of the most fearless adventure photographers of your generation. And look at this. National Geographic featured your work in 3 different issues between 1976 and 1982. As Tyler showed her article after article documenting her career, Isabelle felt a strange disconnect between the accomplished woman described in these pieces and the person her family had been treating as too fragile for adventure. The young photographer in these stories had been celebrated for exactly the kind of courage her children now considered evidence of mental decline. "I want to document your skydiving journey," Tyler said, closing the laptop and looking at her directly. "Not just the jump itself, but everything. The training, the family reactions, the personal transformation. I think your story could inspire other people who've been told they're too old, too careful, too sensible to pursue their dreams." Isabelle considered the proposal. The idea of being documented, of having her private journey turned into a public story, made her slightly uncomfortable. But she thought about Jake's comment about inspiring others, about the calls he received from elderly people too afraid to pursue their own adventures. "What would you do with such a documentary?" she asked. "Share it. Online, film festivals, maybe even submit it to some of the same magazines that used to feature your photography." The story of a woman reclaiming her adventurous spirit isn't just personal, it's political. It challenges everything our society believes about aging and possibility. That evening, as Tyler set up his camera equipment to conduct their first interview, Isabelle felt the familiar flutter of anticipation she'd once associated with preparing for a challenging photo shoot. She was stepping into another kind of adventure now, not just the physical challenge of skydiving, but the emotional challenge of allowing herself to be seen, really seen, for who she was becoming. "Tell me about the woman who used to hang from cliff faces with a camera," Tyler said, pressing record. Isabelle looked directly into the camera lens and smiled, the same fearless smile that had appeared in photographs from mountaintops and remote wilderness locations decades ago. "She never left," Isabelle said. "She was just waiting for permission to come home." Across town, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the social media strategy she'd been developing around Isabelle's story. What had started as damage control had evolved into something far more meaningful. She'd spent hours researching adventure photography, ageism, and the psychology of late-life reinvention, and everything she learned made her more convinced that Isabelle's story deserved to be told properly. She opened a new document and began typing, "Campaign Proposal, Never Too Late," a social media documentation of one woman's refusal to let age define her possibilities. For the first time in her career, Sarah was working on something that felt like it mattered beyond engagement metrics and brand awareness. She was helping tell a story that could change how people thought about aging, dreams, and the courage required to live authentically. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to help her mother-in-law reclaim her identity, Sarah was discovering her own. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and cloudless, with the kind of crystal-clear visibility that pilots dream about and skydivers pray for. Isabelle woke at 5:30, not from her alarm, but from the electric anticipation that had been building in her chest for weeks. Today was the day she would either prove to herself and her family that dreams have no expiration date, or she would discover that some bridges are too far to cross at 76. She dressed with the same methodical care she'd once used when preparing for challenging photo shoots: comfortable clothes, sturdy shoes, and Robert's compass necklace lying cool against her throat. In the kitchen, she made coffee with hands that were steadier than she'd expected, though her heart rate had been elevated since the moment she opened her eyes. Tyler arrived at 7:30 with his camera equipment and an expression of barely contained excitement mixed with worry. "How are you feeling, Grandma?" "Terrified and exhilarated," she said honestly. "Sometimes I can't tell the difference anymore." "That's probably a good sign," he said, adjusting his camera settings. "Mind if I record your morning routine? I want to capture everything leading up to this moment." Isabelle nodded, finding comfort in Tyler's presence and the familiar weight of being behind a camera again, even as the subject rather than the photographer. As she moved through her morning preparations, she found herself narrating her thoughts for his documentary, the process helping to organize her own emotional response to what lay ahead. "I keep thinking about a photograph I took in 1977, she said, spreading peanut butter on toast she wasn't sure she'd be able to eat. "I was documenting ice climbers in Colorado, and there was this moment right before one of them attempted a particularly difficult route. He stood at the base of this frozen waterfall, looking up at something that seemed impossible, and I captured the exact moment when his fear transformed into determination. I remember thinking that I was witnessing someone step across the threshold from one version of themselves into another." She paused, toast halfway to her mouth. "I think that's what today is for me. A threshold." The drive to sky-high adventures felt both eternal and instantaneous. Tyler followed in his own car, his camera equipment filling his back seat, while Isabelle drove with the radio off, needing silence to process the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. The familiar countryside looked different somehow, more vivid, more precious, as if she was seeing it through the eyes of someone about to view the world from an entirely new perspective. At the airfield, Jake greeted her with his characteristic calm confidence, but she could see the extra attention in his eyes, the subtle ways he was assessing her readiness. "How did you sleep?" he asked as they walked toward the hangar. "Like someone who's about to jump out of a perfectly good airplane," Isabelle replied. "Which is to say, not much." Jake laughed. "That's completely normal. Even experienced jumpers get nervous before a big jump. The key is channeling that nervous energy into focus." Inside the hangar, Isabelle was surprised to see a small crowd gathered near the equipment area. Marcus and Jenny, her fellow students from ground school, had come to witness her jump. Several of Jake's colleagues were present, along with other skydivers who'd heard about the 76-year-old birthday jumper and wanted to offer support. But it was the sight of her family that made Isabelle's breath catch. David and Lisa stood near the entrance, their expressions tense and worried but present nonetheless. Sarah was with them, her camera phone ready, but her attention focused entirely on Isabelle. The fact that they'd come, despite their opposition, meant more than she could express. "We couldn't let you do this without us," David said quietly as she approached. "Even if we don't understand it, even if it terrifies us, we're here." Lisa nodded, her medical bag conspicuously absent for the first time in recent memory. "I still think you're crazy," she said with a tremulous smile. "But you're our crazy mother, and we love you." The suit-up process was methodical and calming. Jake helped her into the tandem harness with practiced efficiency, explaining each buckle and adjustment with the patience of someone who understood that feeling secure in the equipment was crucial for mental preparation. The jumpsuit was bulky but comfortable, and the goggles and helmet made her feel more like a pilot than a passenger. "Remember," Jake said as he made final adjustments to their connected harnesses, "your job is to enjoy the experience. I'll handle all the technical aspects. Just trust the process and let yourself feel what it's like to fly." Through the hangar windows, Isabelle could see the small aircraft that would carry them to altitude. A Cessna painted in bright colors with sky-high adventures, emblazoned on its sides. The sight of it made her stomach flutter with the same mixture of anticipation and terror she'd felt before her first solo photography assignment in Alaska. Tyler approached with his camera, his own nervousness evident, despite his attempt at professional composure. "Any last words before you become the coolest grandmother in California?" Isabelle looked directly into the camera lens, thinking about all the people who would eventually see this footage. People her age who had been told they were too old for adventure. People of any age who had been convinced that dreams deferred were dreams destroyed. "I've spent 47 years being the safe choice, the responsible one, the person who put everyone else's comfort before her own growth," she said. "Today I'm remembering what it feels like to be brave. Not because I'm not afraid, but because the fear means I'm doing something that matters." The walk to the aircraft felt ceremonial, like a procession towards some fundamental change in her identity. Her family followed at a distance, Tyler documenting everything, while Sarah took photos from different angles. Other skydivers called out encouragement as she passed, treating her not as an elderly woman making a foolish gesture, but as a fellow adventurer pursuing her dreams. Inside the Cessna, Isabelle found herself seated between Jake and the open doorway through which she would soon exit. The pilot, a weathered man named Carlos who'd been flying jumpers for 20 years, turned to smile at her with genuine warmth. "Happy birthday, young lady," he said. "Ready to see the world from God's perspective?" As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Isabelle looked out the small window at her family standing together on the tarmac. David had his arm around Sarah's shoulders, Lisa was wiping away tears she probably didn't want to admit to crying, and Tyler was capturing it all with his camera while grinning with obvious pride. The takeoff was smoother than she'd expected, the small plane climbing steadily through clear morning air toward their target altitude of 10,000 feet. Below, the familiar landscape of her hometown transformed into an abstract painting of fields and roads, houses shrinking to dollhouse scale, the ordinary world revealing patterns and beauty that were invisible from ground level. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked as they climbed through 5,000 feet. "Like I should have done this decades ago," Isabelle replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it completely. At 8,000 feet, Jake began final preparations, checking their harness connections and reviewing hand signals one last time. The aircraft's engine noise made conversation difficult, but Isabelle found that she didn't need words to process what was happening. This was like the moment before taking a particularly challenging photograph. All the preparation was complete, and now she simply needed to trust her training and embrace the experience. At 10,000 feet, Carlos called back. 2 minutes to jump altitude." Jake moved them toward the open doorway, and suddenly the abstract landscape below became very real and very far away. Wind rushed through the cabin with shocking force, and Isabelle felt her heart rate spike as the reality of what she was about to do hit her fully. "Remember?" Jake called over the wind noise. "Arch your back, arms crossed, chin up. Trust me completely. Ready?" Isabelle looked down at the earth spread out below like a detailed map of her entire life. She could see the town where she'd raised her children, the roads she'd traveled to photography assignments, the landscape that held decades of memories. In a few seconds, she would step out of this aircraft and into the open sky, leaving behind not just the safety of the plane, but the safety of being the person everyone expected her to be. "Ready," she said, and meant it. They moved to the doorway together, Jake's body pressed securely against her back, their harnesses linking them in absolute trust. The wind was intense, the ground impossibly far below, and every instinct screamed at her to step back into the safety of the aircraft. Instead, she thought about the woman who used to hang from cliff faces for the perfect shot, about Robert's promises of adventures they'd never taken, about Tyler's proud smile and the documentary that might inspire other people to remember their own courage. "On 3, Jake called. 1, 2. Isabelle closed her eyes and stepped into empty sky. The first seconds were exactly as terrifying as she'd imagined, a sensation of falling that triggered every survival instinct she possessed. But then, just as Jake had promised, the fear transformed into something else entirely. The sensation of falling became the sensation of flying, of being supported by invisible hands, of moving through space with the grace of a bird. She opened her eyes to find herself floating through clear air, with the earth spread out below like a living photograph. The wind wasn't violent but embracing, and the silence was profound despite their speed. This wasn't the panic-inducing plummet she'd feared, but something close to meditation, a profound sense of peace and freedom that she'd never imagined possible. Through her goggles, she could see the airfield below, tiny figures that she knew were her family watching her transformation from earthbound grandmother into something gloriously, impossibly airborne. The fear was still there, but it had become part of the joy rather than separate from it, evidence that she was fully alive, fully present in a moment that would change her forever. Jake tapped her shoulder and pointed to their altitude indicator. They were approaching deployment height. She nodded, trusting him completely to bring them safely back to Earth, but in no hurry to end this impossible, wonderful flight. When the parachute deployed, the sudden deceleration was jarring for only a moment, before becoming a gentle, controlled descent that allowed her to truly see the world below. Now she could make out individual buildings, cars moving along roads like toys, and the cluster of people at the airfield who were watching her return to Earth as a fundamentally different person than the one who had left it. The landing was surprisingly gentle, Jake guiding them to touch down in the center of the designated area, with barely more impact than stepping off a curb. As they settled onto solid ground and Jake began disconnecting their harnesses, Isabelle felt the strangest sensation, not relief at being safe, but a profound sense of loss that the flight was over. Her family reached them first, David and Lisa approaching cautiously as if they weren't sure whether to congratulate her or check her for injuries. But it was Tyler's face that captured her attention, his expression of absolute wonder and pride as he filmed her first moments back on Earth. "How do you feel?" he asked, bringing his camera close. Isabelle looked directly into the lens, her face still flushed with exhilaration, her hair wild from the wind, her eyes bright with the light of someone who had just remembered what it felt like to be fully alive. "I feel like myself again," she said simply. "For the first time in 47 years, I feel exactly like myself." Sarah, who had been taking photos throughout the landing, looked at the images on her phone's screen and realized she was documenting something far more significant than a birthday stunt. These weren't just pictures of an elderly woman completing a skydive, they were evidence of a transformation, proof that it was never too late to step across the threshold into a braver version of yourself. As Jake helped Isabelle out of her jumpsuit and equipment, she looked up at the sky where she'd just spent the most transcendent minutes of her recent life, then back at her family, who had witnessed her metamorphosis from careful grandmother into fearless adventurer. The woman who had jumped out of that airplane was the same person who had once climbed mountains and chased storms across continents. She had simply been waiting patiently for 76 years to be remembered and welcomed home. Sarah's hands were still shaking slightly as she uploaded the final photo to Instagram 3 hours after Isabelle's landing. She'd spent the drive home from the airfield curating the images, selecting the ones that best captured the transformation she'd witnessed through her camera lens. The shot she chose as the lead image was taken at the exact moment Isabelle touched down, her face radiant with joy, her silver hair wild from the wind, her eyes bright with an inner light that seemed to illuminate everything around her. But it was the caption that Sarah had labored over, writing and rewriting until she found words that honored the magnitude of what she'd witnessed. "Today, my 76-year-old mother-in-law taught our entire family what courage actually looks like. Yesterday, we thought Isabelle Smith was a sweet, conventional grandmother who needed to be protected from her own impulsive decisions. Today, we discovered she's the same fearless adventure photographer who once graced the pages of National Geographic, and she's not done amazing us yet." 3 weeks ago, when Isabelle announced she was going skydiving for her birthday, we laughed. We worried. We tried to talk her out of it with statistics and medical concerns and social propriety. We saw a fragile old woman making a desperate grab for relevance. We were wrong about everything. What we witnessed today wasn't an elderly person being reckless. It was a woman reclaiming the adventurous spirit that decades of, quote, responsible choices had buried but never destroyed. It was someone refusing to let other people's fears define her possibilities. It was a masterclass in what it means to live authentically at any age. Isabelle didn't jump out of that plane to prove anything to us. She did it to prove something to herself, that the woman who once hung from cliff faces with a camera is still very much alive inside the grandmother we thought we knew. If you've ever been told you're too old, too careful, too sensible to pursue a dream, this post is for you. If you've ever felt like the adventurous person you once were has been buried under years of other people's expectations, this is your reminder that it's never too late to dig them out. Age is just a number. Dreams have no expiration date. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop asking for permission to be yourself. Hashtag never too late. Hashtag courage has no age. Hashtag dreams deferred. Hashtag adventure photographer. Hashtag skydiving. Hashtag age positive. Hashtag inspirational women. Hashtag family support. Sarah hit post and set her phone aside, not expecting much beyond the usual likes from family and friends. She'd tagged it with her standard hashtags, but something about this post felt different, more personal, more vulnerable than her usual social media content. Within an hour, her phone was buzzing with notifications. The post had received more engagement in 60 minutes than anything she'd ever shared. Comments were pouring in from strangers sharing their own stories of deferred dreams and late-life courage. The shares were climbing rapidly, and her direct messages were filling with requests for more information about Isabelle's story. By evening, the numbers were staggering. The post had been shared over 3,000 times, and the comments section had become a virtual support group for people inspired by Isabelle's example. Sarah scrolled through messages from around the world. A 70-year-old woman in Australia who'd just booked her first art class. A 68-year-old man in Maine who'd called a travel agent about the European hiking tour he'd been dreaming about for decades. grandmothers and grandfathers sharing their own stories of adventures postponed and dreams deferred. But it was a comment from someone named Margaret Thompson that made Sarah's breath catch. "I'm the 84-year-old woman who jumped with Jake Morrison last year. Seeing Isabelle's joy brings back all the feelings from my first jump. Please tell her she's inspired me to book my second one. Some of us are just getting started." Sarah screenshotted the comment and immediately texted it to Tyler, who was at Isabelle's house helping her process the day's events. His response came back within minutes. "Show this to Grandma. She needs to see what she's starting." Meanwhile, at Isabelle's house, the phone had been ringing almost constantly. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story. A regional magazine was interested in interviewing her about late-life adventures. A morning radio show in Sacramento had called asking if she'd be willing to share her story on air. "I don't understand," Isabelle said, looking overwhelmed as Tyler showed her Sarah's Instagram post on his laptop. "It was just a birthday present to myself. I never intended for it to become this." Tyler scrolled through the comments, his excitement growing as he read. "Grandma, look at what people are saying. You've given them permission to pursue their own dreams." This woman in Texas says she's been wanting to learn to paint for 30 years, but thought she was too old to start. This man in Oregon is finally going to take flying lessons. A woman in Florida just signed up for her first college class at age 72. Isabelle read the comments with growing amazement. These weren't just congratulations on completing a skydive. They were testimonials from people who felt inspired to reclaim their own buried dreams. She thought about Margaret Thompson's comment, about becoming part of a community of people who refuse to let age define their limitations. "Maybe I should respond to some of these," she said uncertainly. "Actually," Tyler said, pulling up a new browser window, "I think you should consider something bigger. Look at this." He'd been researching speaking opportunities for people with inspiring stories about aging and adventure. Senior living communities, community colleges, women's organizations, all of them regularly hosted speakers who could challenge conventional ideas about what was possible in later life. There's a senior center in San Francisco that hosts monthly speakers for their Never Too Late series, Tyler explained. They specifically look for people who've pursued new adventures after age 60. And there's a conference in Portland next month called Aging Boldly that features people who've defied stereotypes about growing older. Isabelle studied the websites Tyler showed her, feeling a familiar flutter of anticipation. She thought about Jake's comment about inspiring other elderly people to pursue adventures, about Margaret Thompson's joy in her post-jump video, about all the comments from strangers who felt inspired by her story. "I'm not a professional speaker," she said hesitantly. "You don't need to be," Tyler replied. "You just need to be yourself. Tell them about the photography career you set aside, about finding those boxes in the attic, about deciding it wasn't too late to remember who you used to be." Sarah arrived an hour later with printouts of the post's analytics and a proposal that made Isabelle's head spin. The Instagram post had reached over 50,000 people organically, with engagement rates that were off the charts for content that wasn't paid promotion. Media outlets were starting to pick up the story, and Sarah's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with interview requests. "I've been doing social media management for 10 years, Sarah said, spreading papers across Isabelle's kitchen table. "I've never seen organic content perform like this. People are hungry for authentic stories about courage and possibility. Your story is touching something deep in people who've been told that certain dreams have expiration dates." She pulled up a video on her phone, a local news segment from Denver, where the anchor had shared Isabelle's story during the evening broadcast. "This is from tonight. They're calling you an inspiration for people who think it's too late to pursue their dreams." The surreal nature of seeing herself discussed on television hadn't fully hit Isabelle when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize with a New York area code. "Mrs. Smith? This is Jennifer Martinez from Good Morning America. We'd love to have you on our show to share your inspiring story about pursuing dreams at any age." Isabelle stared at the phone in disbelief. Good Morning America. The morning show she'd watched for decades while making breakfast for her family wanted to interview her about jumping out of an airplane. I'm not sure I'm television material," she said hesitantly. "Mrs. Smith, authenticity is exactly what our viewers are looking for." Your story has already inspired thousands of people online. We'd love to give you a platform to inspire millions more. After a conversation that left Isabelle feeling like she'd entered an alternate reality, she hung up to find Tyler and Sarah staring at her with excitement. "Good morning, America?" Sarah asked, her social media expertise immediately calculating the reach and impact of national television exposure. "They want me in New York next week," Isabelle said, still processing. "This is getting much bigger than I ever imagined." Tyler was already making plans. "I want to come with you. Document the whole experience for the film. This could be the perfect climax for your story." But even as excitement built around the media opportunities, Isabelle felt a nagging concern about losing control of her own narrative. This had started as a personal journey of self-discovery, a private reclamation of her adventurous identity. The attention was flattering, but it also felt overwhelming. "What if I disappoint them?" she asked. "What if I'm not as inspiring in person as I am in a social media post?" Sarah looked at her seriously. "Isabelle, you've already inspired more people in 24 hours than most of us do in a lifetime. You don't have to be anything other than exactly who you are, the woman who decided it wasn't too late to remember how to be brave." That night, alone in her house after Tyler and Sarah had left to plan their media strategy, Isabelle sat in Robert's old chair with his photograph in her lap. The compass necklace felt warm against her throat, and she found herself talking to his picture, as if he could hear her. "I never intended for any of this to happen," she said softly. "I just wanted to feel alive again, to honor the promises we made about having adventures together. Now suddenly I'm some kind of symbol for people who feel like they've given up on their dreams." She looked at the stack of printouts Sarah had left, messages from people around the world who'd been inspired by her story. A retired teacher in Ireland who'd just booked her first solo trip. A widower in Canada who'd signed up for guitar lessons he'd been postponing for 20 years. A grandmother in Ohio who'd decided to audition for her community theater despite never having acted before. "Maybe this is bigger than just me," she told Robert's photograph. "Maybe this is about giving other people permission to remember who they used to be, before life convinced them to play it safe." Her laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender was listed as Eleanor Rodriguez, and Isabelle smiled as she opened it, expecting a message from her best friend who'd probably seen Sarah's post. "Isabelle, I saw the pictures of your jump and I have something to confess. Watching you pursue your dream has made me realize how many of my own dreams I've filed away under too late and too old. Tomorrow, I'm signing up for that pottery class I've been thinking about for 5 years. And I'm booking a trip to Mexico that I've been promising myself since my husband died. You've reminded me that being 73 doesn't mean being finished. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like. Your friend, Ellie." Isabelle closed the laptop and looked around her living room, at the family photographs, at the familiar furniture, at the life she'd built around being safe and sensible and appropriate. It was a good life, a life she didn't regret, but it was no longer the only life she was capable of living. Tomorrow would bring more interview requests, more media attention, more opportunities to share her story with people who needed to hear that it was never too late to step across the threshold into a braver version of themselves. The woman who had jumped out of that airplane wasn't just reclaiming her own adventurous spirit. She was accidentally becoming a catalyst for others to reclaim theirs. For the first time since making her announcement at Tyler's graduation party, Isabelle understood that this journey had never really been just about her. It was about everyone who'd ever been told that their dreams had an expiration date, everyone who'd been convinced that being older meant being finished, everyone who needed to see that courage could be cultivated at any age. She was no longer just Isabelle Smith, retired librarian and widow. She had become, quite accidentally, a symbol of possibility itself. The green room at Good Morning America was smaller than Isabelle had imagined, filled with the nervous energy of people waiting to share their stories with millions of viewers. She sat in a leather chair that seemed designed for someone much younger and more glamorous, Tyler beside her with his camera equipment, both of them trying to process how a birthday skydive had led to national television. "You look perfect," the makeup artist assured her, stepping back to admire her work. Natural but camera-ready. Very authentic grandmother next door. Authentic grandmother next door. The phrase would have amused Isabelle a month ago. Now it felt like a costume she was being asked to wear, one that captured only the most palatable version of who she'd become. Through the monitor in the green room, they could see the host discussing her story during the show's opening segment. The footage Sarah had captured of her landing was playing on screen, and Isabelle watched herself experience the moment of touching down after her jump, her face radiant with joy and accomplishment. That video has been shared over 2 million times, the producer informed her, consulting her tablet. The engagement metrics are incredible. People can't get enough of your story. 2 million times. Isabelle tried to wrap her mind around that number. 2 million people had watched her private moment of triumph, had witnessed her transformation from anxious grandmother to exhilarated adventurer. First, she would accept the Stanford speaking engagement, because the opportunity to influence how researchers and healthcare providers thought about aging genuinely excited her. Second, she would decline most of the other media requests and focus on planning her next real adventure, not as content for social media or material for Tyler's documentary, but as nourishment for her own soul. She opened her laptop and began researching photography workshops in Iceland, remembering a National Geographic assignment she'd turned down in 1979 because David had been starting kindergarten, and family responsibilities had seemed more important than chasing the northern lights with her camera. This time, she wasn't asking anyone for permission. She was simply deciding what adventure to pursue next, secure in the knowledge that the woman who had rediscovered her courage at 76 was just getting started. The viral moment had been beautiful, and the inspiration it provided to others was meaningful. But Isabelle Smith was learning that the most important audience for her courage was herself, and she had decades of deferred adventures to catch up on. 6 months after her jump, Isabelle stood in the community room of the Cedar Valley Public Library, surrounded by photographs that told the story of 2 lives, the adventurous young woman she'd been, and the fearless woman she'd become again. The exhibition, titled Rediscovered, A Photographer's Journey Through Time, featured her vintage adventure photography alongside new images from her recent trip to Iceland. The Iceland photographs were different from her earlier work, more contemplative, infused with the wisdom that comes from understanding how precious and fleeting opportunities for beauty really are. There was a shot of the northern lights reflected in her camera lens, a self-portrait taken at the edge of a glacier, and a series documenting elderly Icelandic fishermen whose weathered faces told stories of lives lived fully despite hardship and age. "This one's my favorite," Tyler said, standing beside a photograph of Isabelle herself, taken by her Icelandic guide. She was crouched beside a thermal pool at sunrise, her silver hair catching the early light, her camera focused on a pattern of ice crystals that had formed overnight. Everything about the image spoke of patience, purpose, and the kind of deep contentment that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. "Mine too," Isabelle agreed. "It's the first photograph of myself in decades where I look like someone I recognize." The exhibition opening had drawn a crowd that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Local residents who'd followed her story mingled with photography enthusiasts who'd driven from Sacramento to see her work. Margaret Thompson was there, beaming with pride and wearing a Sky High Adventures t-shirt that proclaimed, "Age is just a number." Eleanor had brought 3 friends from her pottery class, all of them planning their own adventures inspired by Isabelle's example. But it was her family's presence that meant the most to Isabelle. David and Lisa stood near the exhibition's centerpiece, a triptych showing Isabelle at 3 different stages of her life. The first panel showed her as a young photographer rappelling down a cliff face in the 1970s. The second captured her mid-freefall during her birthday skydive. The third was from Iceland, showing her photographing the northern lights with the same fearless concentration she'd brought to her work 40 years earlier. "I owe you an apology," David said quietly as they stood together looking at the triptych. "I spent so much energy trying to protect you from risks that I forgot to consider what I was protecting you from, the chance to be yourself." Lisa nodded, her medical training evident even in this moment as she studied the photographs with professional interest. "The transformation in your posture, your expression, even your energy, it's remarkable. As a healthcare provider, I should have recognized that adventure might be exactly what you needed for your well-being." Sarah was documenting the evening with her camera, but but her approach had evolved from social media content creation to genuine artistic documentation. Her photographs of the event would become part of Tyler's completed documentary, but more importantly, they captured the joy of a family learning to support each other's authentic selves. The Stanford talk was incredible, Sarah told a group of library patrons who'd gathered around Isabelle. She spoke to researchers and policymakers about reconceptualizing aging, not as decline but as continued possibility. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Tyler approached with his camera, but instead of filming, he simply stood beside his grandmother and looked at the photographs that documented her journey. Hell! It was both thrilling and slightly terrifying to think of her personal journey becoming public inspiration. Tyler squeezed her hand. "You've got this, Grandma. Just be yourself." 5 minutes later, she was seated across from the morning show hosts, their practiced smiles and gentle questions designed to help her share her story in digestible sound bites. The interview went smoothly. They asked about her photography background, about the family's reaction to her announcement, about the moment she decided to pursue her skydiving dream. But it was the final question that caught her off guard. "What would you say to other people who feel like it's too late to pursue their dreams?" the host asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. Isabelle looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the messages she'd received, about Eleanor's decision to take pottery classes, about Margaret Thompson booking her second jump. She thought about the woman she'd been 47 years ago, hanging from cliff faces and chasing storms, and the woman she was becoming now, someone who refused to let other people's fears define her possibilities. "I'd say that the phrase 'too late' is a story we tell ourselves, not a fact about the world," she said. "I spent decades believing that the adventurous part of my life was over, that I'd used up my quota of courage when I was young. But courage isn't a finite resource. Every day we get to choose whether to honor the dreams we've deferred or to keep deferring them until tomorrow becomes never." She paused, feeling the weight of speaking to millions of people who might be struggling with their own deferred dreams. The woman who jumped out of that airplane last week wasn't a different person than the grandmother who'd been playing it safe for 47 years. She was the same person who finally gave herself permission to remember who she used to be, and who she still could be. The interview ended with a standing ovation from the studio audience, and as Isabelle and Tyler made their way back to the green room, her phone was already buzzing with notifications. The show's social media accounts were flooded with responses, and her own Instagram, which Sarah had helped her set up, was gaining thousands of new followers. On the flight back to California, Tyler showed her some of the responses that were pouring in. The messages were overwhelming in their emotional intensity. People sharing stories of dreams they'd abandoned, adventures they'd postponed, creative pursuits they'd convinced themselves were frivolous or inappropriate for their age. A 67-year-old woman had enrolled in art school. A 72-year-old man had booked a photography workshop in Iceland. A grandmother in Texas had started writing the novel she'd been thinking about for 30 years. Each message was evidence that Isabelle's leap of faith had given others permission to take their own leaps, in their own ways. But it was an email waiting for her when she arrived home that truly demonstrated the reach of her story. The sender was Dr. Margaret Chen, director of the Stanford Center for Longevity, and the subject line read, "Speaking Opportunity, Redefining Aging Conference." Dear Mrs. Smith, your appearance on Good Morning America was brought to my attention by several colleagues who recognize the profound impact your story is having on conversations about aging and possibility. We are hosting a conference next month called Redefining Aging Beyond Limitations, and would be honored if you would consider being our keynote speaker. Your journey represents exactly the kind of narrative shift we need in how society views older adults, not as people winding down, but as people capable of growth, adventure, and reinvention. Please let me know if you would be interested in sharing your story with our audience of researchers, healthcare providers, and policymakers who work with aging populations. Isabelle read the email 3 times, each reading making the opportunity feel more surreal. A month ago, she'd been invisible in her own family's decisions about her life. Now a Stanford researcher was asking her to address experts about redefining aging. Tyler, who was reading over her shoulder, let out a low whistle. "Grandma, this is huge. Stanford, you're being invited to influence how people think about aging and possibility." But even as the opportunities multiplied, Isabelle was beginning to understand that her story had taken on a life of its own. Phone calls came in daily, speaking requests, interview opportunities, invitations to events celebrating late-life achievement. Each opportunity was flattering, but together, they were creating a version of herself that felt increasingly disconnected from the woman who had simply wanted to remember what it felt like to be brave. It was both thrilling and slightly terrifying to think of her personal journey becoming public inspiration. Tyler squeezed her hand. "You've got this, Grandma. Just be yourself." 5 minutes later, she was seated across from the morning show hosts, their practiced smiles and gentle questions designed to help her share her story in digestible sound bites. The interview went smoothly. They asked about her photography background, about the family's reaction to her announcement, about the moment she decided to pursue her skydiving dream. But it was the final question that caught her off guard. "What would you say to other people who feel like it's too late to pursue their dreams?" the host asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. Isabelle looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the messages she'd received, about Eleanor's decision to take pottery classes, about Margaret Thompson booking her second jump. She thought about the woman she'd been 47 years ago, hanging from cliff faces and chasing storms, and the woman she was becoming now, someone who refused to let other people's fears define her possibilities. "I'd say that the phrase 'too late' is a story we tell ourselves, not a fact about the world," she said. "I spent decades believing that the adventurous part of my life was over, that I'd used up my quota of courage when I was young. But courage isn't a finite resource. Every day we get to choose whether to honor the dreams we've deferred or to keep deferring them until tomorrow becomes never." She paused, feeling the weight of speaking to millions of people who might be struggling with their own deferred dreams. The woman who jumped out of that airplane last week wasn't a different person than the grandmother who'd been playing it safe for 47 years. She was the same person who finally gave herself permission to remember who she used to be and who she still could be. The interview ended with a standing ovation from the studio audience, and as Isabelle and Tyler made their way back to the green room, her phone was already buzzing with notifications. The show's social media accounts were flooded with responses, and her own Instagram, which Sarah had helped her set up, was gaining thousands of new followers. On the flight back to California, Tyler showed her some of the responses that were pouring in. The messages were overwhelming in their emotional intensity. People sharing stories of dreams they'd abandoned, adventures they'd postponed, creative pursuits they'd convinced themselves were frivolous or inappropriate for their age. A 67-year-old woman had enrolled in art school. A 72-year-old man had booked a photography workshop in Iceland. A grandmother in Texas had started writing the novel she'd been thinking about for 30 years. Each message was evidence that Isabelle's leap of faith had given others permission to take their own leaps, in their own ways. But it was an email waiting for her when she arrived home that truly demonstrated the reach of her story. The sender was Dr. Margaret Chen, director of the Stanford Center for Longevity, and the subject line read, "Speaking Opportunity, Redefining Aging Conference." "Dear Mrs. Smith, your appearance on Good Morning America was brought to my attention by several colleagues who recognize the profound impact your story is having on conversations about aging and possibility. We are hosting a conference next month called Redefining Aging Beyond Limitations, and would be honored if you would consider being our keynote speaker. Your journey represents exactly the kind of narrative shift we need in how society views older adults, not as people winding down, but as people capable of growth, adventure, and reinvention. Please let me know if you would be interested in sharing your story with our audience of researchers, healthcare providers, and policymakers who work with aging populations." Isabelle read the email 3 times, each reading making the opportunity feel more surreal. A month ago, she'd been invisible in her own family's decisions about her life. Now a Stanford researcher was asking her to address experts about redefining aging. Tyler, who was reading over her shoulder, let out a low whistle. "Grandma, this is huge. Stanford, you're being invited to influence how people think about aging and possibility." But even as the opportunities multiplied, Isabelle was beginning to understand that her story had taken on a life of its own. Phone calls came in daily, speaking requests, interview opportunities, invitations to events celebrating late-life achievement. Each opportunity was flattering, but together, They were creating a version of herself that felt increasingly disconnected from the woman who had simply wanted to remember what it felt like to be brave. It was Eleanor who helped her find perspective. Her best friend arrived at her door 3 days after the Good Morning America appearance, carrying a pottery bowl she'd made in her first class and wearing the slightly clay-stained clothes of someone who'd discovered a new passion. "I've been watching all this media attention," Eleanor said, setting the bowl carefully on Isabelle's kitchen table. "And I wanted to talk to you about something before you get completely swept up in being a symbol." They sat in the kitchen, where so many important conversations had taken place over the years, and Eleanor's directness was both comforting and necessary. "What you did was beautiful," Eleanor continued. "Not just the skydiving but the courage to remember who you used to be. But I'm worried that all this attention is turning your personal journey into a performance. Are you pursuing these speaking opportunities because you want to, or because you feel obligated to inspire people?" The question hit closer to home than Isabelle wanted to admit. In the rush of media attention and speaking requests, she'd lost track of what had originally motivated her decision to jump. It hadn't been about inspiring others or challenging societal expectations about aging. It had been about reconnecting with the adventurous woman she'd once been. "I think both," she said honestly. "Part of me loves seeing how my story has given other people permission to pursue their dreams. But part of me feels like I'm becoming a caricature of myself, the inspiring elderly adventurer instead of just me." Eleanor nodded with understanding. "The pottery class has been wonderful, but not because it makes me an inspiration to other 73-year-olds. It's wonderful because I love the feel of clay in my hands, because I'm learning something new, because it makes me happy. The inspiration part is secondary." That evening, Isabelle sat in her living room surrounded by speaking requests, interview opportunities, and invitations to events celebrating her courage. Tyler was there with his camera, documenting what he called the aftermath of going viral, but she'd asked him to stop filming for a while so she could think clearly. "I want to ask you something," she said, looking at the young man who'd become her strongest advocate. "When you first proposed documenting my story, what did you hope to capture?" Tyler considered the question seriously. "I wanted to show what it looked like when someone refused to let other people's fears define their possibilities. I wanted to capture the moment when you remembered who you used to be. And do you think that's what we're capturing now?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the pile of media requests. "I think we captured that beautiful moment when you landed from your jump," he said slowly. "Everything since then has been about other people's reactions to that moment. Which is meaningful, but it's not really your story anymore, is it?" Isabelle picked up Dr. Chen's email and read it again. The Stanford invitation was genuinely exciting, an opportunity to influence how society thought about aging and possibility. But she realized she needed to make a distinction between opportunities that aligned with her authentic interests and opportunities that simply capitalized on her momentary fame. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Jake Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "Isabelle, I hope I'm not bothering you," he said when she answered. "I've been following all the media attention your story has received, and I wanted to check in. How are you handling being suddenly famous?" "I'm not sure I'm handling it well," she admitted. "It's wonderful that so many people have been inspired, but I feel like I'm losing track of what this was originally about for me." Jake's laugh was understanding. "I've seen this happen to other people whose jumps went viral. The attention can be intoxicating, but it can also distract from the personal transformation that made the jump meaningful in the first place. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. What do you want to do next? Not what opportunities are being offered to you, not what other people think you should do, but what do you actually want to do next?" The question was simple, but it cut through all the noise of media attention and speaking requests to something essential. What did she want to do next? "I want to take photographs again," she said without hesitation. "Real photographs, not just documentation of my adventures. I want to go somewhere beautiful and challenging and spend time behind a camera again." "That sounds perfect," Jake said. "And if that adventure happens to inspire other people, that's a bonus. But the adventure itself, should be for you. After hanging up, Isabelle made two decisions. His documentary was nearly complete, but the ending had evolved beyond what either of them had originally envisioned. It wasn't just about one woman's skydive. It had become a meditation on family, courage, and the ongoing nature of becoming who you're meant to be. "I have an announcement," Tyler said to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd found his own path. "This documentary about my grandmother's journey helped me discover my own calling. I've been accepted to a graduate program in documentary filmmaking, and I'll be spending the next 2 years learning how to tell stories that matter." The applause was warm and genuine, but Isabelle noticed that Tyler's announcement felt natural rather than surprising. Somewhere in the process of documenting her transformation, he'd found the courage to pursue his own dreams, despite his father's concerns about practical career choices. "And I have an announcement too," Lisa said, stepping forward with the kind of nervous excitement that suggested a major life change. "I've been accepted into the Doctors Without Borders program. I'll be spending 6 months in a refugee camp in Jordan, providing emergency medical care to people who need it most." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted Isabelle's skydiving announcement 6 months earlier. This time, the family's response was immediate and supportive, as if they'd learned that dreams deserved encouragement rather than discouragement. David surprised everyone most of all. "I've enrolled in a culinary arts program," he said, with the sheepish grin of someone admitting to a secret passion. "Turns out all those years of criticizing restaurant meals was because I thought I could do better. Now I'm going to find out if I was right." Eleanor raised her pottery bowl, the one she'd brought to show Isabelle months earlier, in a toast. "To the Smith family, who've learned that supporting each other's dreams is more important than protecting each other from risks." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Isabelle found herself standing alone in front of her favorite photograph, the one from Iceland where she looked like someone she recognized. Jake Morrison approached, having driven down from the airfield to attend the exhibition. "Any regrets?" he asked, nodding toward the photograph that captured her in her element. "About which part?" "Any of it. The jump, the media attention, becoming accidentally famous for pursuing your dreams." Isabelle considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had been overwhelming at times. The media attention had been intense, the speaking requests had threatened to consume her time, and there had been moments when she'd felt like her personal journey had become public property. "No regrets about the jump itself," she said finally. "That moment when I stepped out of the airplane, that was mine. Everything else has been other people's reactions to that moment, which has been meaningful but secondary." She pointed to a photograph from her Iceland trip, a shot of an elderly fisherman mending nets while his grandson watched with rapt attention. "This is what I learned from all the attention. My story mattered not because it was unique, but because it was universal. Everyone has dreams they've deferred, courage they've forgotten they possess, adventures they've convinced themselves are too late to pursue." Jake smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd watched his student exceed all expectations. "And what's next for the woman who refuses to let age define her possibilities?" Isabelle pulled a brochure from her purse. Information about a photography expedition to Antarctica scheduled for the following spring. "I'm considering this. It would be my most challenging assignment ever, but also probably my last chance to photograph one of the most beautiful places on Earth." "Antarctica?" Jake said with obvious admiration. "That's not exactly a retirement home activity." "Exactly," Isabelle replied. "I've learned that retirement from responsibility doesn't have to mean retirement from possibility." As the library emptied and the lights dimmed on her exhibition, Isabelle walked through the space one more time, looking at the photographs that told the story of her rediscovered courage. Each image was evidence that it was never too late to remember who you used to be, never too late to step across the threshold into a braver version of yourself. Tyler appeared beside her, his camera finally put away for the evening. "Ready to go home, Grandma?" "Actually," Isabelle said, looking at the brochure for the Antarctica expedition, "I think I'm ready to plan my next adventure." The woman who had jumped out of an airplane on her 76th birthday had discovered something that would sustain her for whatever years remained. The understanding that courage was not a finite resource, that dreams had no expiration date, and that the most important permission she needed for living authentically was her own. 6 months ago, her family had laughed when she announced her intention to go skydiving. Now they were planning their own adventures. Inspired by her example and supported by the family's newfound commitment to encouraging, rather than limiting each other's dreams. The viral Instagram post that had started it all was still being shared, still inspiring people around the world to pursue deferred dreams and reclaim forgotten courage. But Isabelle Smith was no longer thinking about being an inspiration to others. She was thinking about penguins and glaciers and the challenge of photographing one of the world's most pristine wildernesses with 76-year-old hands that had never been steadier. The leap into the sky had been just the beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,